All right, looks like we've got people coming in. Bruce, you're ready to go whenever you'd like.
Okay. Okay, welcome everybody. If you're just joining, we're just starting this webinar, and please be aware that there's the Q&A function available as well as the chat function. So we will be collecting questions and then answering them at the end of today's webinar, which is entitled 1776, the American Character in History and Teaching. This is the second of two excellent webinars run by the National Association of Scholars, and focuses on the question of founding moments and their importance in American history. My name is Bruce Gilley. I'm a professor of political science at Portland State University and a member of the board of the National Association of Scholars. And our three speakers today will each speak for 12 to 15 minutes, and then we will take questions and hope to be finished at about 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time. So this question of founding moments is something that's obviously been animating American history and the discussion of it. We had a seminar on 1620 last week. This week on 1776. Some people think of 1863 as a refounding moment of this nation. Others are talking about the need for a new founding. The Anglophiles among us may look back to 1215 as the founding of America. Certainly, founding moments are not in short supply when we're thinking about American history. And this made me think about Hannah Arendt's famous 1959 essay, What is Authority? And what Arendt emphasized in that famous essay was the importance of foundings, because nations need to understand themselves and their traditions through the replication of stories about and writings about, and even in the Roman case, statuary reflecting their founding moments. We have statuary here in the United States that reminds our citizens of their founders and their founding moments. And Arendt argued that the challenge to authority in any political system is when those founding moments get obscured or distorted. And once they do, she wrote, it is very difficult for nations to maintain authority. Authority is lost because the role of the founding traditions in the maintenance of authority is undermined. Once those founding moments are lost, she says, talking about history is like having a child's pocket knife in competition with atomic weapons. Well, we've seen a lot of atomic weapons on display in the last year in the United States, and so these discussions about our founding moments and our founding characters are very important. We have three excellent speakers today. I'll introduce them fully before each of them speaks, but just in the order of their speaking, first we'll have Dr. Jason Ross, who is Associate Professor and Associate Dean in Liberty University's Helms School of Government. He will be followed by Mr. Conor Friedersdorf, who is a staff writer at The Atlantic. And finally, we will have Dr. Bob Woodson, who is the founder and president of the Woodson Center. I'll introduce them in detail before each of them. They'll have 12 to 14 minutes to speak. Dr. Jason Ross, as I mentioned, is associate professor and associate dean in Liberty University's Helms School of Government. He has an extensive background in history and civic education, having previously served as the senior education program officer at the Institute for Humane Studies at George Mason University, the Ashbrook Center at Ashland University, and the Bill of Rights Institution. He's also served on the faculty at Pepperdine University's Washington, D.C. program. He's published mainly in the American founding, including on the place of slavery within the American founding. He recently served as academic reviewer of major American history textbooks funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities and led by the National Association of Scholars. And I will hand it over to you, Dr. Ross.
Thank you, Dr. Gilly. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for tuning in today. Thanks to the National Association of Scholars for hosting this event and for including me. So we've been asked to discuss what the year 1776 says about the American character and what alternative views of our history, including that of the 1619 Project, miss about the meaning of American history. I'll focus on two key themes today. One is what the 1619 Project obscures about 1776. And the other is what the 1619 Project obscures about 1619 itself. But I'll preface my comments by addressing the reasons that Nicole Hannah-Jones has given for launching the 1619 Project. She claims to be challenging a myth of American exceptionalism that overlooks or slights the legacy of slavery. I don't dispute the very real and painful legacy of slavery, but I don't see any widespread narrative of American exceptionalism that ignores slavery. It's true that historians of the early 20th century were more attuned to issues of class than issues of race. But for a half century at least, American historians have accepted without serious dispute that slavery is the central moral and political issue of the American founding era. Also, during the past 15 years, as I've been active in the history and civic education world, I've seen slavery and its legacy given a prominent place in high school curricula. This is as it should be. Finally, I recently participated in a systematic review of American history textbooks sponsored by the National Association of Scholars. Our review of these texts did not show any mythical story of American exceptionalism overlooking slavery. If anything, it was quite the opposite. So I question the premise that Americans are being taught a national story that obscures or denies the tragedy and evil of slavery. But I will accept Nicole Hannah-Jones's offer to engage in a thought experiment in which we set aside notions of American exceptionalism and ask how we might understand American history differently if we took 1619 to be its founding moment. Again, stripping away any notion of American exceptionalism, any treatment of our national story as somehow unique or special, let's return to 1619. Here we'll find that Portugal and Spain had been exploring and colonizing the New World for well over a century. France had been establishing colonies for half a century. Great Britain was not quite as far along, but by 1619 had about a dozen small settlements in North America and the Caribbean. 1619 was part of a dark chapter in world history that we can trace back to 1441. This is when a Portuguese explorer landed on the coast of West Africa and seized 12 Black Africans. This explorer presented these humans as a gift to the prince who had sponsored his voyages. The prince made a knight out of this kidnapper and asked him to acquire more Africans to put into slavery. During the next 400 years, slavery became ubiquitous in the settlements being established in the New World by these European powers. It's estimated that in this time, 12.5 million Africans were taken captive and sent into slavery in Europe's new colonies. Of those 12.5 million enslaved individuals, nearly half of them, about 6 million, were sent to Portuguese colonies, mostly Brazil. Over 3 million would be sent to Britain's Caribbean colonies. France sent about 1.5 million Africans into slavery, Spain about 1 million, and the Netherlands about 500,000. How many of these 12.5 million Africans were sent to slavery in North American settlements, including Jamestown? About 400,000. This amounts to about 3% of those sent to slavery in the New World. But these 12.5 million individuals enslaved in Europe's colonial dominions represented less than half the total number of Africans who were enslaved in that same time period. Scholars are now beginning to pay more attention to the African slave trade in all of its dimensions. They've discovered that during this period of roughly 400 years, about 6 million Africans were sent into slavery in the Islamic world. This trade began much earlier than the European trade, going back to about 800 AD, and resulting in the enslavement of at least 12 million Africans over that time. In addition, slavery was common within Africa itself. Records are not good, but one estimate is that 8 million Africans were enslaved in Africa during the 15th to 19th centuries. Another historian speculates that the number of those enslaved in Africa undoubtedly surpassed the number who were forcefully exported to the Americas and Asia during this time period. And a third estimate is that 30% or more of the entire African population was enslaved in Africa during this time. By conservative estimates then, it's clear that well over 26 million Africans were sent into slavery during this dark age, of which 1619 is a part. This is truly horrific to contemplate. And I hope by citing this data, it doesn't seem as if I'm trying to diminish the experience of any of these individual human beings who were forced into slavery, whether in Britain's North American colonies or anywhere else in the world. Instead, I want to point out the enormous, staggering scale of this system in the numbers of human lives impacted, in the global scope over which it was carried out, and in the length of time this system endured. As terrible as it is to contemplate the scale of this evil, the broader context leads us toward the more dreadful thought that slavery in one form or another may be more the rule in human experience than the exception. We read of it in Jewish and Christian scriptures. We read of it in the Quran. We read of it in Aristotle. Some claim it exists today in China's treatment of the Uyghur people. For these reasons, a leading scholar of the modern abolition of slavery has called slavery the perennial institution. In light of this, I think the real question of American history is not why slavery persisted so long in spite of our stated beliefs in liberty and equality. Instead, I think that the real question of American history is how the institution of slavery that was so massive, so ingrained in human culture and society, and perhaps even ingrained in human nature itself, went from being accepted almost without a thought for nearly half a millennium to being literally unthinkable in the Western world within relatively few generations. We just don't get this answer from the 1619 Project. Nicole Hannah-Jones claims our democracy's founding ideals were false when they were written. I don't see it this way. I conclude that the massive change in public opinion and practice relating to slavery over the past 200 years has occurred precisely because Americans have accepted our nation's founding ideal of equality as true. To take one prominent example, Thomas Jefferson believed what he wrote about equality. As Jefferson drafted a list of grievances in the Declaration of Independence to demonstrate that George III was a tyrant, the final and most forceful piece of evidence he offered was related to Britain's involvement in the slave trade. Jefferson wrote that the British king, quote, has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere. Please note here that Jefferson argued explicitly that Africans merited the very same sacred rights of life and liberty that Americans were asserting in their revolutionary document. It is true and tragic that this passage was deleted to assuage the guilty consciences of delegates from the Deep South, but that does not mean that Jefferson spoke falsely or that others did not believe his words fully. Jefferson also complained in this deleted passage that slavery was a legacy of British colonialism, and he was right. So as he drafted a plan for settling America's Western territory, he proposed that after the year 1800 of the Christian era, there shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in any of the states created in the West. This proposal failed in the Confederation Congress by one vote. A delegate from New Jersey was sick, leaving his state without a quorum. The New Jersey delegation could not cast its vote in favor of Jefferson's proposed ban. Jefferson was distraught. He wrote to James Madison, the voice of a single individual would have prevented this abominable crime. In 1787, the Confederation Congress finally did pass a scheme for the settlement of Western lands that banned slavery, not in the entirety of the West, as Jefferson had proposed, but in the Northwest Territory. Jefferson was not the only American who believed that the principles he wrote down were true. In fact, in the period between the Declaration of Independence and the ratification of the Constitution, 10 states abolished the importation of slaves. 6 of the states banned slavery outright or passed gradual abolition laws, and 2 more did so shortly after the Constitution was ratified. One historian has called this wave of anti-slavery laws enacted by the newly free American states the First Emancipation. The leaders of this early anti-slavery movement were largely Quakers. They believed the Declaration's commitment to equality was true, precisely because it was consistent with their understanding of God's law. As Americans, we remember today that the Constitution denied the new government the power to ban the slave trade for 20 years after ratification. Madison was right when he argued that this provision was dishonorable to the American character. But again, let us look at the United States in context. Great Britain would not abolish its slave trade until 20 years after the Constitutional Convention either. It did so in May 1807. This success, by the way, owes much to the work of a transatlantic network of anti-slavery activists heavily influenced by the American Quakers. The United States passed its ban on the slave trade a few weeks before this, and the American ban took effect just after Britain's ban on January 1, 1808, which was the earliest date permitted by the Constitution. By comparison, France's revolutionary government had abolished the slave trade in 1794, but that government failed, and Napoleon reintroduced the slave trade in 1802. The French would not abolish the slave trade again until 1817. The Netherlands abolished its trade in 1814. But Spain and Portugal would continue their slave trade for another generation. As Americans, we criticize our founders for delaying the abolition of the slave trade, and rightly so. Despite their delay, though, Americans in the United States were still at the forefront of this historic effort. A final thing Nicole Hannah-Jones and the 1619 Project overlook about the principles of 1776 is just how many Americans in the early years of the Republic believed those principles were true enough to fight for and die for. And many did die for them. Somewhere on the order of 750,000 Americans died in the Civil War. This is more Americans than died in World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Korea, and in every American war combined. This is one of the most profound sacrifices that any people has made in human history. But this is not a sacrifice that would have been authorized by a people who believed, as Nicole Hannah-Jones claims, that its founding ideal of equality was false. To sum up then, the 1619 Project misses almost everything that is significant, not only about 1776, but about 1619. We should reject it. But in rejecting it, we should not resurrect any myth of the American experience as being solely a triumphant story of liberty. Instead, I hope we come to understand our national narrative as showing how liberty and slavery, equality and domination are locked in permanent struggle in our history, in our politics, and even in ourselves. This is our best hope for sustaining a fragile moment in human history during which it has become unthinkable to reduce a fellow human being to slavery. It wasn't always like this, and we should do all that we can to ensure that Americans and the world continue to accept the American ideal of equality as true. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ross. Very nicely stated, and wonderful engagement with 1619 and with post-1776. That's great. Our next speaker is Mr. Conor Friedersdorf. He is a staff writer, as I mentioned, with The Atlantic, where he writes on politics and national affairs. He's founding editor of The Best of Journalism, a newsletter devoted to exceptional nonfiction. In a January 2020 essay in The Atlantic, Mr. Friedersdorf made the case that, quote, placing America's founding moment in 1776 honors the diversity of its people in a way that 1619 does not, unquote. I'll turn it over to you, Mr. Friedersdorf. Your mic needs to be on, my friend.
Sorry about that. Thanks for having me here, a non-expert in scholarship and also in Zoom, as you see. I come to this as a Californian who has always been very curious about exploring different ideas of when we ought to consider the American founding. I always think it would be interesting to think about Spain as being one of the mother countries, or maybe even the mother country of the United States, rather than England, for example, and look at history through that perspective. And yet, as fond as I am of my home state and its Spanish place names, and as much as I was educated in Catholic schools and would like to take siestas and eat dinner later at night, no matter how much I reflect on any founding date, 1776 is always the one that I come back to. I don't need to remind you all, but I will, about the part of 1776 that everyone remembers. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Nothing sums up the American experiment better than that. President Lincoln put it best in a 4th of July address he delivered 82 years later. He talked about the celebrants who traced their ancestry back to the founding. And then he said, we have besides these men descended by blood from our ancestors, perhaps half our people who are not descendants of these men. They are men who have come from Europe, German, Irish, French, and Scandinavian, men like early Friedersdorfs in America, I imagine. If they look back through this history to trace their connection with those days by blood, Lincoln said, they find they have none. They cannot carry themselves back into that glorious epoch and make themselves feel that they are a part of us. But when they look through that old Declaration of Independence, Lincoln continued, they find that those old men say we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And then they feel that moral sentiment taught in that day evidences their relation to those men, that it is the father of all moral principle in them, and that they have a right to claim it as though they were blood of the blood and flesh of the flesh of the men who wrote that declaration. And so they are. That's the electric cord in that declaration that links the hearts of patriotic and liberty-loving men together, that will link those patriotic hearts as long as the love of freedom exists in the minds of men throughout the world. And to me, America is blessed to have that electric cord. Whatever our disagreements, we can all agree on the ideals of the Declaration. Republicans and Democrats, law and order conservatives and libertarians, Claremont Institute fellows and Ivy League scholars, descendants of the Mayflower and newly naturalized immigrants. It isn't quite true that literally every American can embrace the preamble of the Declaration, but the vast majority of us, and majorities of just about every group of us. It's a document that shows we all have utterly equal claims to this creedal individualist nation where citizenship is grounded in universalist ideals. The United States can flourish with its many races, ethnicities, religions, and national origin groups because all sorts of people can unite around the principles of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, to me, it would be foolhardy to sever that cord, and yet there have been efforts to displace the Declaration's central place in the American story. To me, the most vigorous challenge came from the New York Times Magazine. As we've heard already, in 2019, it began publishing the 1619 Project, marking the 400th anniversary of enslaved Africans' arrival in Virginia. And more controversially, the project explicitly aimed to reframe American history, rejecting the centrality of 1776, and instead understanding 1619 as our true founding and placing the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the very center of the story we tell ourselves about who we are. That's a quote from the 1619 Project display text. The Times has since expanded the 1619 Project into a book and promoted classroom materials adapted from it for K through 12 education. And that revisionist narrative has rightly provoked a lot of critiques. My heart was particularly warmed to see the Wall Street Journal's editorial page and the World Socialist website making common cause. But this shows that 1776 is a uniter, not a divider. Movement conservatives and Trotskyites both turn out to be fiercely protective of the revolution of 1776. Both worry that centering race in our history and politics instead divides America in corrosive ways. My own critique of the 1619 Project and defense of 1776 as America's founding was a bit different than others. Like Nicole Hannah-Jones, who created the 1619 Project, I do hope the Times succeeded in causing more people, more Americans, to recognize the remarkable faith that African Americans showed in our country's promise, even in eras when their faith in it was least deserved. But to me, considering 1619 as our true founding would set back rather than advance the cause of racial equity and inclusion. Placing America's founding moment in 1776 honors the diversity of its people in a way that 1619 does not and never can. How does the history of the United States change if we mark the beginning of its history in 1619? For one thing, it puts Black and white people at the center of US history when I would argue that no race belongs there more than any other. Neither the white settlers at Jamestown, nor enslaved Africans sold there, nor the author of the Declaration, nor the African Americans denied the rights enumerated therein, nor any of the people we celebrate on national holidays has any greater claim to this country than the most recently naturalized American of any race or color. All that matters is the embrace of our civic creed. And so I've always wanted children to be taught, as I was, that America was founded on July 4th, 1776, with the Declaration of Revolutionary Ideals, rather than, say, when the first North Americans crossed a land bridge from Asia into modern Alaska, or when the Mayflower arrived, or when George Washington's army secured victory over the British, or when the Constitution was ratified. The words put forth in 1776 would inspire people all over the world to insist that governments are meant to secure rights, that when any government becomes destructive of the ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. The words resonated with Haitian revolutionaries every bit as much as with Thomas Jefferson. How unique and useful to peg our founding to the expression of ideals that so many can share, that are relevant across identities and generations, times and places and countries, and that also happen to coincide with the moment when the earliest residents of our country formally broke with the prior regime, establishing a nation that endures today. To substitute 1619 as America's true founding centers a story of white oppressors and Black victims while overlooking groups as numerous and varied as Indigenous Americans, Hispanics, Asian Americans, and more. And exclusions like that will only grow in salience to this debate as the United States becomes less demographically Black and white than it is today, but remains no less in need of a unifying national narrative and civic creed. What relationship, I wonder, does an Indigenous Hawaiian have to 1619? How about Andrew Yang? What about me? I was born in New Mexico, which entered the Union in 1912, but mostly I was raised in California, where the 1850 Constitution banned slave labor by consensus. Circa 1860, travelers still arrived more quickly from Manila than New York or Washington, D.C. en route to San Francisco and 1 in 10 California residents was Chinese. My ancestors, my dad's side, were German farmers who settled in the Midwest in the middle of the 19th century. And on my mom's side, French Cajuns expelled from Canada by the British and harassed in Louisiana by Catholic-hating Klansmen. I have no English ancestors I'm aware of. If English Virginia, circa 1619, was America's true founding, I'm not sure what that means for me, let alone a member of the Chumash tribe or a once interned Japanese American. But if America's true founding was the moment in 1776 when universalist ideals were put forth, that moment is equally inclusive of everyone, past, present, and future, who shares those ideals. The timeless words and values of 1776, as distinct from its fallible, sometimes hypocritical author, will always be worth uniting around as long as America's unfinished effort to form a more perfect union endures. Indeed, as Danielle Allen of Harvard reminds us, the Declaration's preamble is more than just life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So let's hear 2 sentences more that fewer people remember. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it's the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Now, in Professor Allen's telling, quote, we have 2 jobs: laying the foundation on principle, clarify your values, know what you stand for, and 2, organize the power of government to secure those rights, to effect safety and happiness. The best we can do, she says, is figure out what is most likely to affect our safety and happiness, make probabilistic judgments, and alas, make mistakes. We have to enter into the business of democratic agency, she says, with humility. She said that to college students during a commencement address at my alma mater, Pomona College, though not in the year I graduated. Activism is valuable, no question about it, she told those students. But our job at the end of the day is to build institutions that secure our shared rights. That means understanding the user manual, all right? The institutions. Now, if you want an oversimplified and provocative account of recent trends in America, you could say that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is less central to today's politics and civic creed than diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, I happen to support diversity and inclusion. I much prefer equality under the law to equity, but regardless, we're focusing more on the identity characteristics that divide us than the ideas that unite us. And we're losing sight of that latter part of the preamble too, acting as though activism is more important than institutions. This, I think, is a mistake, and it's a mistake that comes from ceasing to put the ideals of 1776 at the center of our civic life as lodestars for the future. Thanks.
Very good. Thank you. I'm going to appreciate the concise comments. Also, the reference to the 1619 project. Clearly, this is, like I always say, right or wrong, you got to hand it to them. They made a splash. And when I was a journalist, making a splash was a big part of the task. So, but good for them and good for you guys for responding to it. Very interesting comments, Mr. Friedersdorf. So finally, I will turn it over to Dr. Bob Woodson, who is founder and president of the Woodson Center, a nonprofit founded to help residents of low-income neighborhoods address the problems of their communities. He is also the founder of 1776 Unites, a nonpartisan and intellectually diverse alliance of writers, thinkers, and activists who are challenging recent attempts to reframe American history. He also has a new initiative, as if he hasn't led enough initiatives, but here it is, Voices of Black Mothers United, which amplifies the voices of mothers of children lost to street violence and collaborates with law enforcement and community members to make our neighborhoods safe and peaceful. Dr. Woodson is an early MacArthur Genius Awardee, recipient of the 2008 Bradley Prize, the Presidential Citizens Award, the 2008 Social Entrepreneurship Award from the Manhattan Institute, and the 2020 Salvatore Prize for American Citizenship from the Heritage Foundation. His new book is entitled Lessons from the Least of These, The Woodson Principles. Great to have you, Dr. Woodson. It's your turn.
I just unmuted. I hope you can hear me. Yes. Someone once said that I was the first non-communist to win the MacArthur Prize. I take great pride in that. I lead an organization, the Woodson Center, the last 40 years. I'm a veteran of the civil rights movement, but I left that movement in the late 60s on the whole issue of class, because a lot of people who suffered and sacrificed most did not benefit from the change. And that I saw the civil rights movement moving towards a race grievance industry at that time. And so I left and began to work on behalf of low-income people of all races, because Dr. King said, what difference does it make to have the ability to live in the neighborhood of your choosing or to eat in a restaurant of your choice if you don't have the means to exercise that right? So just having an opportunity is insufficient to realize that opportunity, that the means must be provided for people to take advantage and walk through the doors of opportunity. But when the 1619 Project emerged, I felt that the hard left was using America's racial past as a bludgeon to really assault and attack the civic institutions of this country and also undermine its founding principles and values. And therefore, since the left was using the race issue as its messenger, we felt at the Woodson Center that the response to that should be Black-led. So I put together 1776 Unite and brought together Shelby Steele, other prominent Black conservatives and thinkers, but also not just conservative thinkers, Clarence Page of the Chicago Tribune, Bernie Anderson at the Wharton School, an economist, brought together freedom-loving people who understood that America should never be defined by its birth defect of slavery. But we did not want to bring together a group of people just to offer a counter argument, but we wanted to offer an alternative inspirational narrative that challenges not only the information, but to offer inspirational stories of how Blacks achieved. One of the fundamental premise of 1619 is that America, because of its history founding in slavery, is forever flawed, that racism is in its DNA, and that all white America will always be the oppressors and all Black people are victims to be compensated. And so what we did is we wanted to attack the fundamental assumption that the problems facing large numbers of low-income Blacks today, with the 70% of out-of-wedlock births, the high crime, the drug addiction, Hannah Nicole Jones and her associates contend that these problems that Black Americans face today represent the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. And so we wanted to refute that. And so we brought together not just scholars, but also activists, because we believe that people are motivated to change and improve, not by hearing a message, an affirming message, but we really believe that experience will always trump an argument, and the witness is more powerful than an advocate. And so what we set out to do with our researchers is challenge the notion that Black Americans' problems of out-of-wedlock births, a lack of economic development is related to this legacy. So we commissioned our essays to look back, and what we found, for instance, in terms of the composition of the family, that when slavery ended in 1865, one of our scholars looked at the records of 6 major plantations to find out what was the state of the family of slaves. They found that 75% of all slave families had a man and a woman raising children. And many of them legally married with testing. 75% of Blacks were illiterate at the time. And Blacks set up Sabbath schools. And records indicate that they were able to reduce the illiteracy rate from 75% down to 25%. in about 50 years. When the Freedmen's Bureau sent its agents south to find out what the government could do to aid Blacks in learning to become literate, they came back and what there's little that they can do because of the Sabbath schools of what Blacks were doing on their own. Another evidence of when whites were at their worst during that period, Blacks were at their best. There were at least 20 Blacks who were born slaves who died millionaires. But these are facts that are being hidden from the American public and Blacks and whites alone. For instance, in 1818 in Mississippi, a woman named Biddy Mason was born. She was a slave. She was illiterate. She had 3 children, one by the slave master. He was a Mormon, so he moved from Mississippi to Salt Lake City, and she walked behind a wagon for 1,000 miles doing that trek, tending to the sheep. And when he arrived at Salt Lake a year later, he then went to California, where it's now is Los Angeles. And that's when she discovered that this was a free state, and a judge freed her, and she joined a small group of free Blacks in Los Angeles. And she was a midwife, and she was an herbalist, and she delivered children, and she had $1.50 a day. For 10 years, she saved enough to buy land in what is downtown Los Angeles today. And as a consequence, she built homes on that, and she became a successful real estate person. And she helped founded the AME Church. And when she died, she was worth the equivalent of $3 million. She became a philanthropist. And there are other Blacks like Biddy Mason, whose stories weren't tell. For instance, we're saying that the education gap in the South in 1920, the education gap was 3 years. For whites, it was eighth grade, 5th grade for Blacks. Well, Booker T. Washington partnered with Julius Rosenwald, the CEO of Sears, and they put up $4 million. The Black community raised $4 million within the group and constructed 5,000 Rosenwald Booker T schools. And they were operating on half the budgets of white schools. But as a consequence, studies show that between 1920 and 1940, the education gap, as I said, was 8th grade for whites, 5th grade for Blacks. Because of the Rosenwald schools, that education gap within 20 years closed to within 6 months. So the question was, if the education gap could close at a time during this period, why can't the education gap be closed today when Blacks are running most of the education systems in there? One other final point about the composition of the family. Another study revealed between 1930 and 1940, a time during the Depression, when the unemployment rate was 25% within in the white community, it's 40% the Black community. The marriage rate in the Black community during the 10 years of the Depression, when racism was enshrined in law, was the highest marriage rate of any other group in society. And Thomas Sowell, in his studies, revealed that the poverty rate between 1940 and 1960 declined from 82% down to 30%. It was declining, but all of this changed in 1960s with Clowen and Piven at the Columbia University School of Social Work, who was socialist, who decided that if we can separate work from income and entice Blacks to come into the welfare system, it will bring about social upheaval. So within the period, and the poverty programs assisted by setting up offices, recruiting people into welfare. The nuclear family was defined as Eurocentric and therefore racist. The Black Power movement supported it. The women's movement supported it, along with the government opening its doors. Millions of Blacks flooded into the welfare system at a time when the unemployment rate was just 4% in New York City. And so the declines that we're witnessing today in these cities are not a result of a legacy of slavery and discrimination, but the social policies of the 60s that undermine the moral and spiritual foundations and the familial foundation that help Blacks define its success. And so what we are doing at the Woodson Center is we have developed curriculum to counteract the 1619 curriculum. We are developing curriculum that tells the stories of successful Blacks in the city of Chicago, for instance, where we're seeing the crime and violence. In 1929, there were 731 Black-owned businesses. Black owned $100 million in real estate assets in the Brownsville section of Chicago. And I can give you the statistics for Durham, Greenwood, other Black Wall Streets throughout the country. But these are facts that are kept from the American public, which shows that when whites were at their worst, Blacks were at their best. The question that doesn't get answered, if Blacks could achieve education parity, we built our institutions, every major city had a Black-owned hotel, finance, we had our own railroad. If we could accomplish these things at a time of slavery and Jim Crow, why are Blacks failing today in systems run by their own people when most of the cities where these declines and inequities exist are being run by liberal Democratic mayors? And so we are offering it through our curriculum. We had 8,000 downloads within 2 weeks of release of this curriculum. And we are working with school boards and others to get this message across that America is defined by its values, and we affirm those with our actions. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Dr. Woodson. We've got some questions in the Q of A. I always get to abuse my chair position, which I'm going to do fully here, and then I will actually ask if the speakers have responses to their presentations of the others. Can I ask the three of you to bring us back a little to 1776 and the Declaration of Independence? Because it is what I think with this webinar, we are trying to kind of recenter on 1776, and yet not simply as a contrast to 1619, right? I mean, to interpret 1776 as a retort to 1619 is to basically make 1776 all about 1619 anyways, right? So you're not really saying there's anything about 1776 except it's a negative 1619. And is that all there is to 1776? Is it simply a contrast to claims of inequality with its promises of equality, or is there something more about 1776 that this kind of being sort of gang tackled by 1619 is obscuring even as we try and get our way back to 1776? And maybe just in the order you spoke. So Dr. Ross?
Well, one thing I hinted at in my talk, and I might have expanded on, is that slavery in some ways is a legacy of the aristocratic world, the feudal world. And Americans of 1776 were doing their best to break away from that world. Not all did. Not all were interested in breaking away from that world. And so you did have in the Deep South a plantation system that sort of replicated some of the features of aristocracy and feudalism. But that's not Jefferson's vision. And again, I wanted to point out that as he was thinking about what is our culture and what is our politics going to look like as we settle this Western territory, it's got to be democratic. And in Jefferson's view, that means slavery has to be abolished. Slavery can't be a part of the future of this Western territory. And he was not completely successful in extricating slavery from the development and settlement of those Western lands. But I think that's one of the issues that sometimes is hard for Americans to see, because we view slavery purely as a racial institution. And certainly you cannot take away that racial dimension to slavery the way it was practiced in America and in the West. But for Jefferson and others of his generation, he also saw this is the way of the old world, and we are now in the new world, and we want that clean break from the past.
I believe that the 1690 is only an opportunity to educate Americans about the true history of this country, that there was flourishing, that Blacks fought in every war to defend this nation, and the question why they did so, and that they did so before the American promise. But a lot of people, including a lot of our students, don't realize the resilience of Black America in the face of slavery. That's the real story that people ought to be talking about, the resilience and the fact that we built institutions, hospitals, hotels, our own railroad. No one knows that Blacks owned a railroad in Baltimore that successfully ran from Baltimore to Maine for 18 years and financed by our own institutions, the burial societies and the churches. These are, and so this is an opportunity to really tell the American story. Not a single Black was ever tried for treason in this country. If they believed in it, why doesn't everybody?
Among the many things that strikes me about 1776, it's obviously a radical break with the past on a world scale. And yet, despite being radical and revolutionary, the founders managed to pull off this trick of uniting the 13 colonies, at least enough that they pulled off the revolution. And that was quite a thing at a time before anything like speed of travel or communication or mass media that we know today. They took these people who considered themselves mostly residents of a colony, some with loyalties obviously to the crown, others from countries other than England, and they managed to find a statement in the Declaration that was a master stroke of rallying behind a cause. And they had, in some senses, much more diversity than we have to deal with today to unite around. The other thing that strikes me is that it was a radical revolution that was also conservative in a sense, and more of that conservatism would manifest in 1789. But even as early as 1776, going back to what I mentioned about Danielle Allen's commentary about the Declaration, these weren't revolutionaries who wanted to tear everything down and start history anew and eliminate the past. They wanted to draw on the insights of a coherent philosophical tradition, and they wanted to build constructive institutions. It was a statement of, we're going to found it in these revolutionary principles, but we're also going to be constructive going forward. And, those are still both elements that we need today. And I think that we've lost both of them, not just an attachment to the ideals, but also an attachment to constructive change through institutions.
I just want to ask if any of the three speakers had any quick responses to what their fellow speakers have said, just in case there's something pressing or outstanding that you'd like to add just before we go to the Q&A.
Yeah,
I would just like, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Dr. Woodson, after you.
I would just like to add a footnote to that. George Whitefield did more to unite the colonies is because he rode on horseback to every one of those colonies. This was a conservative ground game. We don't have a ground game today. He spoke personally to each one. 70% of the colonists probably heard him preach. And that's what helped unite the colonies.
I appreciate that. George Whitefield as the ground game for America's democratic revolution, and I can get on board with that. I thought from Dr. Woodson's talk, one important point was your perception that the hard left back in the 60s was using race as a way to push its socialist and Marxist agenda. And that's the way it was in historiography. That's the way that race in the founding became an issue with New Left activists who were beginning to exploit that racial tension and animosity as a way of getting where the economists never could. They couldn't make a dent when it came to class as a critique of American society, but they could use race to make a critique. And so I thought that was a very important point. And it reminds me that the 1619 Project has been successful as a journalistic project. I don't remember the timing of this, but I seem to recall that all of the curricular materials that were announced by the Pulitzer Center were announced within a couple of days of the publication of the 1619 Project. I don't have the dates in front of me right now, but my recollection is these materials have been put out too quickly for them to have been inspired by the project. My recollection is that they came together. So anybody who's watching and has kids in public schools, be very wary about what your school is putting in front of your children. Call your school board, run for school board, call your principal, superintendent, find out what materials are going forward. This is not to say that your students, your children should not be learning about the legacy of slavery. And that's something that needs to be front and center in our students' historical education. But we don't want to be learning the kind of narrative of the 1619 Project where it's almost as if there are unbridgeable racial differences that are assumed by the project, and a kind of almost a racial caste system that the project implies or points toward. And I thought in Conor's talk, what connection do most Americans have to 1619? As a nation of immigrants, what proportion of our population had no relations here in 1619? It's got to be a massive proportion of our population had no connections here in 1619. And so most of America has no logical connection to the date 1619. I thought that was a very profound point.
Okay, good. Thank you for that. So I'm just going to throw some questions out from the Q&A, and I'll just go by those that are getting kind of thumbs up from others, suggesting they have some maybe broader interest. So one question from Martha is, do the ideals expressed in the Declaration pre-exist in colonial charters or other documents? And I guess this does speak to our seminar last week on 1620, but what are the historical antecedents to 1776?
There are lots of them. One of the things that is, I think, unique and distinct about Americans, or the people who settled America, is that they wrote things down. So we have volumes and volumes of founding documents, and you can go through Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Virginia, and you can see charters, and you can see bills of rights and constitutions. And so all of these documents. There's a lineage and there's a history of their development and articulation. And so yes, these all of what we see in the Declaration of Independence is sort of a distillation, crystallization of conversations about self-government, about rights, about liberties that had been going on indigenously in the British American colonies for 150 years, up to the point of 1776.
I would just add that you also have, in addition to founding charters and legislative documents, you have case law trials, right? Like the Zenger trial, for example, that is looked to as a kind of early harbinger of the First Amendment and press freedoms. So you have a functioning judicial system in the colonies as distinct from English common law that begins to create its own body of laws and precedes the revolution in some ways.
Let me field another question. And I like this question because it does speak to what I was trying to get at with what else is 7076 about. And I guess at the risk of disrupting the Whiggish tone of today's webinar, let me try and inject a little Toryism here. One interpretation of 1776 is it's an expression of American nationalism. Is an expression of a nation ready to step out from the limits of being a British colony and found itself not so much for the purpose of liberal rights and equality and individual self-expression, but to come together as a nation, as an expression of something more, and that one of the key drivers was to be able to become an empire, and to become an empire in the West, where the British had said, you will not expand. So this was a moment of nationalism and expansion and European imperialism. Dare we use the word? Oh my God, we're all supposed to faint. But I mean, I do think there's and of course that interpretation can come from the hard left, right? I mean, there's a Marxist left that says this, but I don't think empirically, I think empirically we may be on the same grounds if normatively the Marxist left thinks this was a bad thing, but the Tory imperialists think this was a good thing to become incorporated into a liberal empire. So the question from Vesna was, do the guests agree with Professor Mearsheimer at Chicago that we must nurture American nationalism?
It could be a loaded question. That term nationalism is a loaded word. So I think every nation has an identity. Every nation has to be bound together by something other than force. That's not freedom if you're bound together solely by force. Nationalism in a qualified sense. Frankly, one of the reasons why I'm so concerned about the 1619 Project is that I think it points us toward the solution that racial nationalism is the only response to an attack of this kind. So that's one of the profound fears that I have about these kinds of projects, these interpretations of our nation's history that focus on difference and that assume the differences are irreconcilable. And I think what is profound when you reflect on the span of American history, even going back to 1619, is that we have overcome so much in terms of those kinds of differences. And I think you're raising a provocative point, Dr. Gilly, when you talk about an empire, Americans wanting to found an empire of liberty. I almost wrote in my talk that Jefferson was a colonizer, because he did have a plan for colonizing the West without slavery. It's going to be democratic. There's going to be no vestige of the aristocracy of the old world.
As the British had already done for 200 years in their colonies in the Caribbean, for example, moving towards self-government and the elimination of slavery, and as they were doing elsewhere in the British Empire at the time. So yeah, interesting. Dr. Woodson or Friedersdorf, what about the question of nationalism?
I think it's an interesting thought experiment to imagine Jefferson writing a preamble to the Declaration that, instead of talking about everyone being endowed by our Creator with inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, we imagine a document of a preamble of expansionary nationalism, talking about how out with the British Empire and in with the American Empire. I don't think that would have galvanized and garnered the same support and united the people that became the United States in the same way. I think you would have seen the same sorts of divisions that you've seen throughout American history when some factions wanted empire and some factions said, no, this is an abomination, what we're doing in the Philippines. No, this is an abomination. We shouldn't be joining these European wars. We shouldn't be engaging in the Cold War in Latin America in this particular way. Aspirations for empires have always been one of the most divisive things in America. Now, there are other kinds of nationalism than expansionary empire nationalism. And I suppose the view that I would take is that we do need something that unites us, but that we can be united by a civic creed, that is sufficient, particularly a civic creed, and with it a kind of conservative attachment to a place where we live that we call home, a territory that we would defend if some other country were to invade it. And to me, that is sufficient. We don't need a kind of an expansionary nationalism among that. But I would finally say that one kind of bridge between these views that runs through John Winthrop and Ronald Reagan both is the idea that we're not going to be an expansionist military empire, but we are going to be an example to the rest of the world. And I do think that is at least an aspiration that does unite many Americans.
Yeah, I would just add that Black Americans always had to live with the contradictions. I was born during the Depression, and I remember the war years as a child. But I also remember that when Blacks went off to fight against fascism, we had two V's: victory against fascism in Europe and victory against racism at home. So we fought on foreign shores in a segregated units with the fact that when German soldiers were transported across the country to concentration camps, they could eat in restaurants and their Black guards could not. Even with the severe contradictions, we still held fast to the nationalist loyalty to this country's promise. There's also the contradictions that when we hear about reparations, we're not understand that Native Americans owned Black slaves. The 5 civilized tribes had 5,000 slaves on the Trail of Tears. There were free Blacks who owned slaves. There was a unit in Louisiana that had 1,000 Blacks organized in a fighting unit to fight on behalf of the Confederacy. And so this country is filled with contradictions. But we were all united by the promise of this country.
And I believe half of Oklahoma was recently declared native land because of their support for the Confederacy. Another one of those contradictions in American history. Good. So here's a related question to what Dr. Woodson has just said, and it comes under the category of what I would call whataboutism. So anytime you propose or remind people about lofty principles contained in a declaration or a constitution, people will always say, well, what about? And then cite a empirical instance. And so I think the gist of the question here is, at what point does the whataboutism invalidate the principle? Right? So, I mean, the Soviet Union had very lofty principles on the rights of women and the rights of free expression, but we know empirically those were not achieved to such a degree that it did bring into question the sincerity of the principles themselves. And the question is raised is, has the 1619 Project sufficiently brought into question the sincerity of our founding principles in 1776?
Well, I think in 1776, this was a draft that Jefferson prepared, and it was debated. And so we sort of talked about nationalism at the founding era. How do they see themselves as a nation? Well, they didn't really see themselves as a nation. They thought of themselves as 13 separate states that were united in their shared allegiance to the British Empire and united in their opposition. And so the American nationhood, such as it was, developed over the course of debates, conversations, conflicts regarding exactly what do these principles mean. And so I tried to draw a little thread in my talk. Jefferson believed what he said, even though he was born to a slave-owning father, and even though he went to his grave owning slaves himself. He believed what he said, and he practiced it as far as he could, and within the political limitations that he faced. Other Americans who followed him believed, particularly Quakers, people of religious faith, they believed that this principle of equality was true, not just in a political sense, but in a theological, a spiritual sense. It's true because it comports with the law of God. And so this, I think, is this question of who is America as a nation, what does 1776 mean to America and its nationality? This is an ongoing conversation. It's an ongoing process of hashing out the meaning of equality. And so I think the more profound thing, though, is that from where we started in 1776 to where we've gotten now, we could not have gotten to where we are without that first assertion, all men are created equal.
Even above that, I can speak from the Black experience. It was our Christian faith that was above these principles. It is a faith deeply involved with the whole concept of redemption, of being fulfilled. It was deeply relational. It was not transactional. It was relational. And so this is what that if I went back and looked at the words of 20 top Black gospels over the last 30 years, there is not a single reference to slavery. It's always, Lord, don't move the mountain. Give me the strength to climb. Don't take away my stumbling block. Give me the strength to go around. Or I'm going up the rough side of the mountain. All of these talk about the struggle. I don't feel no ways tired. It's all about the future, about the promise, about redemption, about not being defined by what I used to be, but what God can make me in the future. And there was a heavy reliance upon faithfulness. Someone asked Mother Teresa why, I think it was Senator Packwood, didn't she feel frustrated that she was not more successful because there are 3 million people who need her? She can only accommodate 300 in her hospital. And she said, God requires faithfulness of me and not success. And so Black folks live by that principle that if we must be faithful. So that to me transcended even the principles that are articulated in the Constitution.
Here's another question, and I think it speaks to the question of a refounding. When we start in my opening remarks, we were talking about various founding dates: 1215, 1620, 1776, 1863. People now talk about the need for a new founding, a refounding of America, and it's been, 150 years or so, 170 years. Maybe it's time for a new founding. So one question that has got some interest is: given the original intent of the Articles and as adopted by the Constitution, should there be a reconvening of the Constitution that, to once and for all, dispel the notion of African people as being considered property, and any other things that might go into a refounding?
Well, anybody who has spent any amount of time in the notes of the debates of the Constitutional Convention will know how difficult a proceeding that was. We think about the Great Compromise or compromises of the convention, and we sort of whitewash or understate the degree of animosity and discord that was present in those debates. And I think, if anything, a replay of that today would be even worse. I suspect that if any effort, serious effort, were to be mustered to put together another constitutional convention, that would be an indication that the game's over.
I've thought about the question of what other dates more recent than the Emancipation Proclamation, say, might Americans one day look back on as new foundings. I think extending the franchise to women may well be one of them. I think the most recent that one could make a case for is perhaps the I forget the name of the law, but the 1965 change in immigration laws that ended the long period that more or less banned people from most Asian countries from immigrating to the United States and becoming citizens, and that the move toward an immigration policy that was more in sync with the universalistic ideas of the Declaration could be considered a kind of refounding or a completion of the American founding, and that depending on how our immigration laws work from here on out, we'll look back to that moment as one that portended tremendous demographic change. And I would argue that that aligned policy better with our founding ideals, but certainly that changed the course of the nation and who would become a part of it.
One other thing that occurs to me is we think about 1776, we think about 1787. We don't talk a lot about 1791. This is when we get our Bill of Rights, and particularly the First Amendment. So we sort of think of the Constitution as all of a piece, But the First Amendment, the Bill of Rights as a whole, was appended to what the framers gave us at the insistence of the people. And so as I think back to, I mentioned the Quakers. Basically, as soon as the Constitution gets ratified, the Quakers start petitioning the new government for policies to limit the slave trade, if not to ban it outright, and also to ameliorate the condition of slaves. And so one of the first debates in the first Congress in 1790, before the Bill of Rights is passed, is, do we even accept these petitions? Do we listen to these petitions? And James Madison said, yes, we do. So James Madison, who drove the Bill of Rights through the ratification process, knew that this was a tactic that was being used, and that was being used by anti-slavery activists to petition for limits on the slave trade and protections for those in slavery. He went through with it anyway, or perhaps because this was a way for the American people to voice their displeasure and opposition to the institution of slavery. So I think for us to maybe revisit 1791 as a founding moment, the moment when the people completed their acceptance of the Constitution and insisted, if we're going to abide by this document, you must promise, you as our rulers, that we have the right to free speech, we have the right to publish, we have the right to assemble, we have the right to our religious belief and practice. And without those protections, we will not accept this Constitution.
So it was the glorious revolution of the American founding.
Perhaps.
I want to hand it over to Chance Layton, because I think, Chance, you maybe want to answer that question. I also, Chance, some of the attendees are wondering about transcript and the live stream video. If you could just tell us about that.
I can take that question, Bruce. So for the transcripts, I'll be following up with the speakers individually to get the transcripts from that, and then we can post those along with this. And then the video itself should be up on our YouTube page. It'll be take usually about a day to get it through, so sometime tomorrow it'll be up and folks can see it there. And we'll post it on our website as well and send out a notice about it to all of the folks who've registered or attended or signed up. So you should all get a notice once it's up and live saying that here's where you can access it.
Yes, sorry, I had my mic muted.
Is it also possible to get the chat? Because there's a lot of great chat going on.
Yes, just send an email to that same address, contact@nas.org, and I will be able to follow up with you.
And Jason, may I add a comment? Jason, when we're talking about rights, and I totally agree with you, but we should not also forget the warnings coming from Samuel Adams that a general dissolution of principles and manners will surely overthrow the liberties of America than the whole force of a common enemy. While the people are virtuous, they cannot be subdued, but when they lose their virtue, they'll be ready to surrender their liberties to the first external or internal invaders. If virtue and knowledge are diffused among the people, they'll never be enslaved, and this will be their great security. Final, neither the wisest constitution nor the wisest laws will secure the liberties and happiness of a people whose manners are universally corrupt. This is why I really believe that low-income Black folks are going to be the sleeping giant, because they are the ones who are being used by the left to as their moral authority. These things are going to secure justice. Well, when they speak for themselves, this will undermine it. That's why we're organizing Black mothers, because 82% of Blacks support the police. They're against defunding the police. and also 60% of Blacks polled when asked whether racial discrimination is the biggest barrier to their advancement answered no. And so even though these are what the polls indicate, the left purports to speak on behalf of the so-called marginalized. That's why what we're doing is giving a voice to the so-called marginalized who speak for themselves. And to me, that's the best way to undermine the authority, the moral authority of the left.
Okay, I'm going to just throw out one final quick question, give you each about a minute on this. And this is several people in the chat and in the Q&A have asked. And it comes back to the term Dr. Woodson used, the ground game. We need a ground game to reassert the importance of our founding principles and maybe the civic nationalism, if we can call it that attends that, and the uniting force of the Declaration and perhaps later of the Articles and the Bill of Rights. We all agree with that in theory. What's our ground game? What ponies do we get on to go from colony to colony to make sure that that actually makes a difference in the face of the overwhelming power of the 1619 Project in our institutions?
The education is local. Call your kids' teachers, call the principal, call the school board, get on the school board, be engaged, be informed. We have a positive story to tell about our country. It's not exclusively positive, and we don't want it to be, but there is a positive story to tell. And I think for our young people to grow up to be healthy and productive citizens, they need to understand that positive story as well as the negative. Slavery and liberty have been intertwined here in the United States. It's been an intertwined part of our history. We should never forget that. And if we want slavery to be a thing of the past, we have to keep remembering that ongoing fight through our history between those two impulses. So we don't want to discount or discredit completely the arguments of people like Nicole Hannah-Jones, the 1619 Project. We don't want to dismiss them out of hand, but we have a better way of addressing these issues.
I believe that we must, there are 5 conservative think tanks that have a collective budget of about $250 million. If they were to take 2% of that and invest it in the fund so that when grassroots people like these workers up in Smith College stand up, that money ought to be invested in them. We ought to be taking a portion of $100 billion that are spent on elections of conservative candidates and invest a fraction of that in grassroots people who are in the trenches and fighting. Scholars must leave the hallowed halls of the academy and go in and find out what is working among working and low-income people and write about them in your journals, and not just stay aloof, but go in and as the Pope said, you know, the sheep should bear some of the smell. The shepherd should smell like the sheep.
One of my biggest concerns in recent years has been the institutions that are kind of knowledge generating and sense making institutions, academia and journalism and the arts being captured by, I guess I would call it a wing of progressivism that I don't think even represents a majority opinion within these institutions, but that nevertheless is wielding tremendous power and generating a tremendous amount of preference falsification. There's a book, what is it? Private Truths, Public Lies, that I really recommend anyone thinking about this. And to me, I'm struck when I think about the 1619 project that Nicole Hannah-Jones has really not engaged in debate with any intelligent critic of it.
No.
And there are a wide range of people, as I mentioned before, literally from Trotskyites to the Wall Street Journal editorial board. You could pick any place along that spectrum if you wanted to engage critics in good faith. Insofar as these debates aren't going to happen within traditional quote unquote mainstream journalistic organizations or within the academy, they need to happen somewhere. And I know that places like National Review, City Journal have traditionally seen themselves as a kind of counterweight to the liberal media and have focused on raising up conservative voices for that reason. And I think that mission is defensible and important. But I also think that we need a place of coming together for a public discourse among people from different perspectives. One, if we believe in the power of our arguments to prevail, but also if we want to end this preference falsification by showing that there are intelligent critics of these ideas and that they can triumph in debate. And I think that they will if those debates happen. So I think that there's a tremendous opportunity to build different kinds of organizations, different kinds of programs, lecture series that put money and build credibility and prestige and carry out that mission. And that's one thing that I would love to see happen.
Okay, well, I want to thank our three speakers for really great presentations and responses to the Q&A. As Chris has said, you'll be able to find the transcript and the video. And if you need the chat, you can email the NAS. This has been great. Get out there, get on your donkey, smell like the sheep, step out, speak out, get the ground game going. This is a very important part of our American future as well as our American past. And I want to thank everyone for joining. And please make sure to stay in touch with the NAS, send large amounts of money, participate in our forums, support our work, and keep up the good work, everyone. Thank you so much.